back of it to talk about for-profit subsidiaries, other interlocking not-for-profits that they might be involved with, like a home health agency or a nursing home. And then when you get the for-profit corporation records, you can go back to your state corporation records and cross-check it and find out what that company's set up to do. So that's at least a start to get at what they're doing.
Thank you very much.
This is C-SPAN 2 coverage from a panel discussion held this past week by the National Press Club and a group known as Investigative Reporters and Editors. The keynote speech to this gathering was delivered by Ray Bonner, an author and journalist. We now bring you our coverage of that speech.
Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Greg Spears and I'm president of the National Press Club and Washington correspondent for Knight Ridder newspapers. I'd like to welcome you to the first joint seminar of Investigative Reporters and Editors and the National Press Club. Founded in 1975, IRE is the leading educational organization for journalists. The Press Club, which was founded in 1908, is one of the world's leading news forums. Before introducing the guests at our head table, I'd like to remind you in the audience today that if you have any questions for our speaker, please go to the mics, which are located on the floor, and ask them. And please do ask them from the mic so C-SPAN can pick up your questions. I'd like now to introduce our head table guests and ask them to please stand briefly when their names are read. I also ask the audience to withhold applause until I've read all their names. Starting at my left and your right, Alan Schlein, Bureau Chief of the Schlein News Bureau. Dave Martin of the Harrisburg Patriot News. Jim Neff, author of Mobbed Up, Jackie Presser's High Wire Life in the Teamsters, and a director of the IRE. Judy Miller, weekend editor and assistant city editor of the Miami Herald and an IRE director. Hank Ryan, WHDH-TV Boston and an IRE director. Larry Lippman, the Washington Bureau Chief of the Palm Beach Post. Skipping over our speaker for the moment, Jonathan Salant of Syracuse Newspapers and the chairman of the National Press Club Speakers Committee. Sonia Hilgren, Washington editor of Farm Journal and a member of the Board of Governors of the National Press Club. Jackie Koscheck of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. Christopher Roche of Scripps League Newspapers. And Olive Talley of the Dallas Morning News and a director of IRE. Our luncheon speaker today has been a journalist for just over a dozen years, but has seen more and done more than most reporters do in a lifetime. Raymond Bonner, a former reporter for the New York Times and for the New Yorker magazine, got his start in journalism at age 37 when he picked up and moved to Central America in 1980. He gave up a law career, which included stints with Ralph Nader's Public Citizen Litigation Group and the San Francisco District Attorney's Office. And instead of the courtroom, he pulled into Central America just in time for a Bolivian election that became a coup. A year later, he was working for the Times in El Salvador and spent the next 3 years reporting for the paper, primarily in Central America. His book on the region, Weakness and Deceit, U.S. Policy in El Salvador, received the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award in 1985. However, Mr. Bonner's reporting in El Salvador also got him into trouble with both the Reagan administration and his bosses at the Times. In 1982, he and a Washington Post reporter, Alma Guillermoprieto, both wrote about an alleged massacre in the village of El Mozote, supposedly carried out by an elite El Salvadoran military unit trained by the United States. The stories appeared a day before President Reagan told Congress that the El Salvadoran ruling junta was making, quote, a concerted and significant effort to comply with internationally recognized human rights, and, continuing Mr. Reagan's quote, was achieving substantial control over all elements of its own armed forces. Assistant Secretary of State Thomas Enders told Congress that U.S. officials had found no evidence of the massacre Mr. Bonner reported upon. U.S. Embassy officials banned him from briefings and denigrated him before other reporters. Right-wing commentators criticized his reporting. The New York Times recalled him to New York and put him on the business desk in 1982. He later took a leave of absence and resigned from the Times. Well, now, as Paul Harvey would say, here's the rest of the story. On its front page, on October 22nd, the New York Times reported the following. El Mozote, El Salvador, in a small rectangular plot among the overgrown ruins of a village here, a team of forensic archaeologists has opened a window on El Salvador's nightmarish past. Nearly 11 years after American-trained soldiers were said to have torn through El Mozote and surrounding hamlets on a rampage in which at least 794 people were killed, the bones have emerged as stark evidence that the claims of peasant survivors and the reports of a couple of American journalists were true. On behalf of the National Press Club and investigative reporters and editors, it is my pleasure to welcome Raymond Bonner.
Thank you. It's a real honor to be here, to have been asked to speak. I think the summary you've heard probably, as I was listening to it in part, I thought, well, we could probably go right to the questions, as I can imagine what they would be. It saved me from doing some summary. Speaking of the front page, I got this note. It may have been the most satisfying correction on the record on the front page of The Good Gray Lady in years. That was from the great Bill Kovich, who was at the New York Times and should still be there in my view. This note, Galileo and Bonner still right after all these years. From John Kiffner. I got a lot of messages after the front page stories in the Times and in the Washington Post. And I suppose the one that in many ways sticks with me and has the most relevance for this group came from one of this town's premier investigative journalists, and deservedly so. And he said, congratulations, it was nice to see the stories. And then he said, and this is a direct quote that I'll never forget, I never knew what to make of the charges and countercharges at the time. And I thought, boy, if this guy, and he is really a premier investigative journalist, if this person had doubt at the time about the charges and the countercharges, what does that say about the state of investigative journalism? And I don't say that meaning that what I wrote and Alma wrote should have been taken as the gospel or as the final and absolute truth, but for this person to have basically said he was giving as much credence to the government denials, I find the most intriguing and also perhaps the most troubling. So what does it say about investigative journalism? Perhaps it's this. Note from John Crutzen, another former, everybody seems to be a former New York Times correspondent, now with the Chicago Tribune, and also a terrific investigative reporter. And he wrote, the whole episode ought to stand as a monument to the utter failure of the press during the Reagan era. And now we're, of course, moving on to the Clinton era. Before we do that, however, let me give you just a little more background, perhaps, on El Mozote and what happened. We've had the short version. Now I'll give you the New Yorker, or the old New Yorker version. There was a I'm reminded in doing so also of once hearing Senator Harkin speak to a group of, for the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, to a fundraising dinner to a group of young lawyers. And he was talking about how when he'd been a congressional aide, he'd discovered the tiger cages in Vietnam. And as I looked around the audience, I realized most of the people he was speaking to didn't know very much about Vietnam other than from history. They were too young to have lived through it. And as I look around this group, I realize that you're younger or I'm older, and that many of you may not have, and understandably not have, lived through the Central America sagas, and certainly not the specifics of El Mozote. I'm also interested, this letter to the editor after Newsweek wrote a column, an article on the El Mozote recently. A woman wrote from Sunnyvale, California, "Your article on the El Mozote massacre of 1981 horrified me. I am appalled that U.S. officials would flatly deny that nearly 800 people were killed in this village, and that ignoring problems like this won't make them go away." Well, let me tell you something about what happened, and if this woman was appalled, perhaps I should give you some more details about the denial. In terms of what happened, I just found this morning, again, more contemporary account of what did happen. In front of one hovel lay a blue knit infant's bonnet near a plastic baby bottle. Inside, among the ruins, skeletons of 2 bodies were discernible, along with the jumble of bones from an undetermined number of others, possibly members of the same family or maybe just friends. Down the mountain trail a short distance, 12 recently cut 12-foot planks, 10 inches by 3/8 of an inch, were propped against the trees. On the patio of the adobe hut, the saws, machetes, and crude homemade hammers were stained with drops of blood. Inside, 5 skulls were strewn among the smashed tiles. The men had been carpenters. A couple of 100 yards away, on the other side of some beehives, the lone partially burned body of a man who appeared to be about 40 years old was sprawled on the dirt floor, his head a few feet from the family's altar on which rested 3 crudely framed religious pictures torn from a magazine, one of Mary and the Christ child, another of Christ on the cross. Brown beans from a ruptured white bag had spilled under his torso. At the edge of a cornfield, under the green leaves of the banana trees, was a pile of 14 bodies, infants and men and women in their teens and early 20s. Horrified disbelief was reflected in their wide eyes and gaping mouths. In the heap was a child, perhaps 5 years old. There was a months-old infant wrapped securely around the buttocks in a clean cotton bath towel, as if he or she were being carried, perhaps by the face-down woman in plastic sandals. The earth was littered with spent M16 automatic rifle cartridges. The victims were members of an evangelical group and had gathered in a house for protection. The house was shambles. "Mama, they're killing me. They've killed my sister. They're going to kill me," screamed the 9-year-old son of Rufina Amaya. She was one who had managed to escape. But in addition to her son, somewhere along the ruins in Mozote were the skeletons of her blind husband and 3 daughters, ages 3, 5 years, and 8 months. While the villagers were being herded together, Mrs. Amaya had slipped away. From her hiding place in the trees, she heard the soldiers' conversation. "Lieutenant, somebody here says he won't kill the children," said one soldier. "Who's the son of a bitch who said that?" the lieutenant answered. "I'm going to kill him." Mrs. Amaya recalled, "The soldiers had no fury. They just observed the lieutenant's orders. They were cold. It wasn't a battle." Later, I met a man, Cesar Martinez, who was 46 years old. He had been told by the guerrillas to leave the area because the army was sweeping through, but he'd stayed. He fled, but the soldiers killed his mother and sister and his sister's 2 children, ages 5 and 8. Sitting next to Martinez on a rope bed as we talked was 15-year-old Julio, who had been in a gully when the shooting started in his village. The soldiers killed his mother, father, 9-year-old brother, and 2 sisters, ages 7 and 5. Julio had returned to the village to bury his family and 2 of his friends, ages 7 and 10. In Cerro Pando, the toll of 149 included 24-year-old Rosaldo Argueta, who was pregnant, 1-month-old Jeremiah Argueta, and 10 men and women in their 70s and 80s. In Guacamaya, the soldiers went house to house, killing tiny infants and old people. They hauled 10 villagers to the church where they executed them. As Greg said, the U.S. government denied this ever happened. The American ambassador at the time, Dean Hinton, said he did not, quote, have any reason to believe the reports are true. None of the tested sources available to the embassy has given us even a hint of massive civilian casualties. Thomas Enders, Assistant Secretary of State for Latin America, went before Congress a few days later and said, quote, there is no evidence to confirm that government forces systematically massacred civilians in the operation zone, or that the number of civilians even remotely approached the 733 or 926 victims cited in the press. He said, in fact, there were probably not more than 300 people living in the village. That was the beginning, I suppose, of the cover-up that went on until this last November, when stories started coming out. By the way, I was there not only with, I was not there with Alma. Alma was working for the Washington Post, and I was working for the New York Times. And she reminded me, I'd forgotten this, that when I was going in, I'd called her, I suppose this is a journalistic faux pas at best, and said, listen, Alma, I'm going in with the guerrillas. She didn't like the idea at all and immediately arranged to go in also. I was as well with Sue, and then Alma, who's a very dear friend, in addition to being a terrific writer and journalist. Alma was in there came in afterwards. I'd gone in with Susan Meiseles, the justifiably acclaimed photographer, and Susan shot pictures of the massacre, some of which are in the Columbia Journalism Review article recently. And Alma smuggled out, hand wrote, I learned this later, of course, in longhand on a piece of paper, and had it taken out and then filed to the Washington Post. It was totally coincidental that the New York Times stories and the Washington Post stories appeared on the same day. Now, when Bill Dedman asked me to speak on Mozote, he said, speak about, what happened, the effect on you personally, what it means for foreign policy, and so on. But I don't think what it meant for me personally is particularly important. But I think what it means for journalism and investigative journalism is very important. It had a definite chilling effect on the reporting from Central America. Even General Nutting, who was the senior American military commander at the time, said that the reporting turned around after the attacks on Alma and on me. The attacks were led, actually, by the Wall Street Journal's editorial board. As Ralph said yesterday, some masochists of us who read it, the schizophrenic Wall Street Journal, as he also said, because their reporting is so superb. The journal that dedicated the entire column editorial thing was not one of these days where they were going to split it half and half. I got the whole column. Media's War, it was called. And as Alma said, They attacked me because I was with the New York Times, and the power of the New York Times on a story like this was more, apparently, they felt, than the Washington Post. The column raised Sidney Schamberg from Cambodia in his reporting, David Halberstam, his reporting from Vietnam, and essentially the message was, and now Ray Bonner is going to do in Central America, i.e. deliver it to the communists, just like Schamberg and Halberstam did Vietnam and Cambodia. There were many colleagues who thought it was a nice honor, and of course there was that, I won't deny it, but there were also costs, and there were costs for journalism and the coverage of Central America. I remember one reporter coming up to me and saying she'd gotten a note from her editor with the Wall Street Journal editorial saying, "Don't let this happen to us." Another reporter said to me, a colleague at the paper, who was in Central America after I was, "I'm not going to let this happen to me." It did have a chilling effect. It is tough day after day after day after day to write against the wind. There were many times I found it difficult to continue to write stories about human rights abuses, about killings, about massacres of peasants. But I don't know what you do when the government keeps contending, as it did during the Central America, during El Salvador and Nicaragua, and keeps repeating it over and over again in the case of El Salvador, that the human rights situation was improving and Duarte and the military were really reformists, and et cetera, and these human rights abuses aren't occurring and peasants aren't really being killed, and besides we don't know who's doing it, and what about the left? Or in the case of Nicaragua, when they keep repeating over and over and over and over again that the Sandinistas are communists, and if we don't stop them in Central America, before we know it, they'll be all the way up to the soft underbelly of Kansas, as Bob White used to say. It's tough. As Ralph said yesterday, journalists aren't supposed to crusade. You're not supposed to go on crusades, and we're not. But where is that line between continuing to write the story as you see it and writing the story that goes against what is being said in Washington? Now, it seems to me, though, to have any value from the Mozote and its aftermath, I mean, many people have said to me, and as most of these notes and a lot of telephone calls, you must feel vindicated. Don't you feel good about that? Vindication, vindication. As I said to somebody yesterday, look, personally, I'm not sure it's that important. We're in this business, we give lumps, and we take our lumps. But he said, well, maybe it's not important for you personally, but it's important for us as journalists to see vindication like this. Perhaps, but I also think it's important to try to draw, if possible, some larger messages or some larger lessons. I think it's harder, at first I think it's harder with the Cold War over. I remember when, I think it was Newsweek, somebody who called me after the front page story saying that in fact this massacre had occurred, saying, well, what does it mean? I mean, what's the lessons? What do we learn from it, et cetera, et cetera? And I said to him, and I find it hard in the aftermath of the Cold War, but because I don't think you will have foreign policy driven by this blinding anti-communism. Not by anti-communism, but the blinding anti-communism. I use the adjective importantly because somebody pointed out that George Will wrote a column in Newsweek in which saying that I had said Alger Hiss had been vindicated and the vindication discredited anti-communism. Yes, Alger Hiss has been vindicated, and frankly for me that's important vindication. Really significant vindication. But I never said that it discredited anti-communism. It's the blind anti-communism, the rabid anti-communism, the ideological, unyielding anti-communism that gets the government to deny, to lie, to cover up, like they have in the Mozote case. And the Mozote case, of course, is not the only, and not even perhaps, and probably not even the most important. But it's the one I'm familiar with. But the attacks still continue. I ran into Ken Noble from the New York Times, who was going into Somalia, and he came through Nairobi, where I was living up until about 48 hours ago. And Noble has been writing out of Angola. And he has been getting letters from people, right-wingers, conservatives, attacking him for his reports about Jonas Savimbi. Jonas Savimbi, remember, the great Democrat of the Reagan administration, the true Democrat. Jonas Savimbi, who went to an election and lost, and now has decided that he doesn't want to play by the rules and is going back to war. I only digress for a second to ask what would have happened if the Sandinistas had done that after their election a few years ago. But Ken is being attacked. Now, as he points out, because the times have changed, certainly small t and cap T as well, it's probably not going to have any impact or significant impact on him, at least publicly, because I don't think anybody's going to give much credence to criticisms of Jonas Savimbi. And in fact, Ken's reporting, as one who lives in Africa and therefore now spends a lot of time in Britain, I can tell you the British press, when it comes to writing about Jonas Savimbi, and I mean the responsible, not the tabloid British press, but the really good British newspapers are much tougher on Jonas Savimbi than any American newspaper is. So the attacks, I guess, still continue. But where I really think we're going to see it, and I guess as journalists I would make a cautionary plea, and that's in writing about the Middle East and Islam, and particularly Islamic fundamentalism. I think anybody who tries to put Islam in some kind of a less than demonizing light is going to be pretty severely attacked. I mean, most people view Muslims as terrorists and so on. I mean, we saw it in the case in some ways, in, of course, Peter Arnett during the Gulf War, how his patriotism was questioned because of his reporting from Baghdad. And I think that's probably where we're going to see it next. There was a book review about a book about Islam in the Wall Street Journal recently. Actually, it wasn't a book review, it was just a column saying that the author of the book, and it's a very academic, solid book, was being romanticizing about Islam. Where else it's going to come from in foreign policy, and that's what I tend to write about more, is foreign policy, or totally, I don't know. Is it going to be different under Clinton, since that's one of the issues in this conference, covering Clinton? No. No. Maybe it won't be as blatant. Hopefully it won't be quite as ideologically driven, but they're going to have their foreign policy secrets, their foreign policy goals. And I think maybe at first it's going to be tougher for journalists to look behind them and see what the true foreign policy agenda is. And I see there was a small blurb in the paper, in the Post this morning, about Christopher meeting with neoconservatives trying to assure him that he's not going to sell out the country. I'm not sure who they're worried now that he's going to sell out the country to, since communism no longer seems to be a big problem. But the meeting was with the people who, during the Reagan era and the Cold War of the Reagan era, were convinced that there was a communist behind every revolution, behind every bit of unrest. I've often thought that what newspapers should do is for every reporter they have, I realize this is a luxury and not every paper could do it, but I think the Times could and I think the Post could, both the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the bigger papers. For every person they have covering a beat like the State Department or the Pentagon or the Justice Department, they should have another reporter whose job is to look behind what is being said publicly. You can't, now I know the reporter on the beat may not like that very much, but I think the New York Times and the Post and other major papers have an obligation to report what the government is saying. I know there are a lot of people on the, primarily on the left during the Reagan years, obviously, who were angry because they'd see the New York Times put on the front page. I remember when Haig, during his brief period, was popping off about Central America, and it would lead the New York Times. They'd be furious. You know, why are they giving credence to him? Why are they letting him say these things? Why are they putting it on the front page, etc.? I tell you, when I wrote my book about Central America, I was awfully glad that the New York Times had reported all those things, because it made it easier for me to then point out the discrepancies between what was being said officially and what the truth was. So I think you need that, and you need somebody at the Pentagon writing about those things, but I think just as much you need somebody who goes there and says, all right, now what's really going on? What aren't they telling us behind the briefings? And I think that would go a long way. Obviously, the healthy skepticism about government pronouncements is needed. I have to say also, I think sometimes the skepticism is not healthy, that we do become cynical, that we don't believe anything that the government says. And someplace, I suppose, we have to strike a balance. I don't think, and to go back what the opening, it does bother me when people who are investigative journalists do say, I didn't know what to make of the charges and the countercharges at the time, basically saying, I believe the government when it says something like this didn't happen. 11 years later, it's now acknowledged that it did, although as Alma and Susan both say, it's not really vindication, because in fact, they never had any doubt all along about what had happened. So thank you very much, and I will be now happy to entertain your questions.
Let me ask the first question while our listeners are going to the microphones on the ballroom floor to ask the questions. Why didn't other reporters confirm the story of the massacre by going to Mozote?
Well, it wasn't that easy at the time. I mean, you can't just get in your car and drive up to Mozote. Susan and I had gone in through Honduras, wading across rivers, walking at night, never knowing when there might be an ambush, which we were I can tell you, I was plenty scared. So you couldn't really do it. I mean, by the time they'd gotten in there, the evidence wouldn't have been there. We got in right after, well, obviously from what I read to you, while the bodies were still there. Cy Hirsch believes, not on Mozote, but generally one of the problems is that other reporters don't follow up. When somebody else breaks a story, other reporters don't follow up. I think there's some legitimacy to that, perhaps, but in this case, that doesn't explain it. It was just hard to get to. And I do think also that, I mean, when the attack started, they were pretty vicious. I mean, the Wall Street Journal did that, and then the other thing the Wall Street Journal did, that two or three nights later, the Wall Street Journal editorial writer George Mellon was on McNeil Lehrer, and with Sidney Schamberg. Sidney Schamberg was a columnist at the New York Times at the time and was, interestingly, about the only one who came to my defense and wrote a column called The Can-Do Bombardier about Tom Enders, when Tom Enders had been in Cambodia and when Tom Enders had tried to cover up a bombing in which several hundred people were killed. And Mellon and Schamberg appeared on McNeil Lehrer, and Mellon accused reporters of being Marxist and having Marxist tendencies. And Schamberg said, well, you know, you can't brush the whole press corps that way. Who are you talking about? And he said, well, Ray Bonner, for one, has a political orientation. So, you know, the attacks were pretty severe. And, you know, I'm just telling you these things factually. I'm not elevating my role in any of this at all. I mean, and I think they did have a chilling effect. I mean, I heard it from other reporters, and then I heard it secondhand from people, you know, who tried to, who went down and did stories about the press years later. I mean, they're still writing about this in the impact. I got a call recently from somebody in California who's writing a book about the press, and this is being raised. You know, those attacks do have an impact. I'm not saying they deterred anybody in this case.
Yeah, Ray, in connection with the government's response to the reports on Mozote, you used the term cover-up. So I assume that you're taking the position that the government was not just guilty of, you might say, willful ignorance, but also of actively covering up its knowledge of the massacre. But that actually wasn't my question, although if you want to elaborate on that, that'd be great. My question actually is something that's always troubled me, and I guess probably always will. If somehow we could unearth all of the secret records and documents of the defense and intelligence agencies from those years, have you ever wondered whether it might not be possible that the U.S. government was not only complicit in, let's say, covering up the activities of the death squads, but may have even had some role in coordinating those activities, or may have been in some way sponsoring them? Is that a possibility, or is that just too paranoid?
I think Alan Nairn, for one, I know, did a lot of reporting and writing about that, and I think most of it appeared in the Progressive. And it's certainly a possibility. I mean, I wouldn't say it's being paranoid, thinking that that's a possibility. I mean, we certainly knew what was going on, or it's gross incompetence, as you say, and I'm not sure, you know, in Dante's hell, I'm not sure which circle you would be in between gross incompetence, not knowing what happened in Mozote, and covering it up once you found out. And there would be a different degree, I suppose, of, I don't know, on a moral level, I'm not sure if there would be any greater degree of moral culpability if we're allowed to engage in that, moral questions. Knowing what happened and covering it up and continuing to fund. I mean, we knew what the Salvadoran army was up to. We knew what the Salvadoran military was up to. They knew about the massacre. So if they don't, they are guilty of, you know, virtually almost criminal gross negligence. So does it really make any difference covering it up and continuing to fund them, or being out there actually training them? I don't think so. The foreign policy, in fact, was to support the Salvadoran government and to distort and lie about what was going on in order to continue doing so.
My name's Elmer Sevilla, Native American journalist, freelance, and you touched on something that I'm concerned about, and that's where's the line of crusading and reporting drawn? We've had, as you know, a number of massacres of our own here in this country, which were largely ignored, and when there's an attempt to bring up the facts and figures of who was killed and who was massacred and why, frequently run into the stigma of being a crusader. You know, why don't you keep quiet? You know, that's what are you on that crusade about? So I'd like to know your own experience about what you've learned about where that line is. Do we have a right or a moral obligation to continue talking about those things, or should we back off because of that?
Well, I've never heard reporters say they're on a crusade or accuse anyone of being on a crusade. Of course, it's always the editors, and it's basically a way of saying, you know, we don't want any more of this story. No, I don't think you back off. Obviously, I mean, if there is a line. I suppose if I had continued to write, you know, 50 more stories about Mozote that didn't say anything else but repeated the same thing over and over again, you know, whether that was a crusade or whatever, I think that would not have been good journalism. the same time, what do you do when the government, I mean, this is the dilemma that I saw during the Reagan era, is when the government continues to insist on something. I mean, how many times can you write the story saying, essentially saying they're lying? I mean, how many times can you keep writing it? They really have the advantage. I mean, Elliot Abrams at the Human Rights Bureau had the advantage because he could every day say, you know, we find that there's progress in El Salvador on human rights and things are getting better and this and that. And he could say at the same time, the Sandinistas are a bunch of communists and so on and so on. How many times can you keep writing the situation's not getting better in El Salvador on human rights? I mean, there is a problem. I don't know where the answer is. I think it's on a case by case or basis. But there is a problem because the government has the advantage. The press reports what the government says, and I think has an obligation to. Although at some point I assume we don't need to report everything they say when they're saying the same thing over and over again. But if you go back, again, I'm the most familiar with Central America. If you go back, and particularly, I think it got worse in Nicaragua. The charges against the Sandinistas. Over and over and over again. And what do you do if you're a journalist down there and you see it differently? And it was very tough during the Cold War era because no journalist wanted to be charged with having lost, putting aside for the moment that it's ours to win or lose, having lost Central America to communism. I mean, the 40s in China, who lost China debate isn't that far removed.
Following up on that, my name is Mary Beth Sheridan from AP. I was wondering if you had any advice, if any of us cover some controversial massacre, some similar situation to the one you did, on how to write the story to protect yourself from charges that you're biased or you know, using partial information or something like that. I mean, is there any way to sort of write the story differently or handle the whole controversy differently?
I don't see how. I mean, I don't know, and I guess my question would be, why should you? I mean, you know, you're a journalist. You're going to write every story with the same degree of whatever source requirements they are, whether it's about a massacre or whether you're writing about something in Washington, D.C. or wherever you're based. Why should there be a different standard because they're going to come after you? And there probably is. I mean, I think there were times the New York Times got you know, when one of my stories came in, I know after a while they did get a little more cautious in one, I suppose, maybe an additional confirmation. I don't think that's the way it should be, though. Just because you're going to be attacked and the story's going to be attacked. Well, if you as a journalist believe, look, I've reported this to the same degree that I report any story, and I'm confident about what I'm writing, I think that's enough. If it's controversial, you're going to be attacked anyhow. I mean, I think Alma and I wrote our stories, and I can tell you they were carefully edited, and rightfully carefully edited. I don't mean censored at the New York Times before it went into the paper. There was no other way to have written it. In fact, we probably, as it turned out, we put too much caution in them. Well, I mean, you know, I mean, we attribute, you know, according to, but there's no proof, and this can be denied, etc. It's, you know, the usual cautionary stuff. When in fact, you know, as we now know, or as it's now been confirmed, as they say, the massacres did happen. No, I don't think you write it any. You shouldn't write it any differently.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm intrigued with the Wall Street Journal editorial attacking you. Did you ever discover a paper trail as to who put whom up to this? And
I don't think anybody had to put the Wall Street Journal up to it. I don't think you're going to find any conspiracy between any paper conspiracy between the Wall Street Journal and the Reagan administration and their views on Central America and communism.
What was the date of that editorial? Do you happen to remember that?
February 10th, 1982.
Okay. Well, I'm interested in the one newspaper attacking another newspaper. If they need any encouragement, maybe you argue that they don't need any encouragement, but
well, maybe there was. Frankly, I don't think it makes a lot of difference if they were encouraged or they weren't encouraged. I mean, I mean, I doubt if they were encouraged. I mean, look, there's a symbiotic relationship between editorial boards and government officials, probably at all newspapers. They talk to government officials just like they talk to other people. I mean, I'm sure, I don't think it took a great deal of...
You don't think there's a story there?
No. Well, I suppose if... I mean, bloody interesting. I mean, it would say an awful lot about the Wall Street Journal, I can tell you that. I mean, to think that they needed the Reagan administration to put them up to this would say something about the Wall Street Journal, which somehow, I don't think they needed it. I don't think they needed it. But it would be a good story.
I had a question about your paper that you were working for at the time throughout all of this. You mentioned the editing process that goes into it, and they were happy enough and thought well enough of the story to put it on the front page. And what I haven't heard you talk about is the whole process that turned around and you being recalled and sent to the business section.
That's pretty good. I think I got about 20 minutes before that question. I mean, I was prepared for the question, and I knew I was going to answer it, and I've been asked it enough times, although I guess too many years out in the African sun, I've forgotten what the answer is. Look, as I said before, my reporting did not fit the tenor of the Times, small t, cap T. If you want the New York Times version, I was green, I was inexperienced, and they brought me back to New York to give me some training. Legitimate. I mean, I was green. I'd like to think I was young, but unfortunately I wasn't. But, the problem with that is I think I should have been judged on what I was writing. Maybe that's a problem, maybe I was, but I think I should have been judged on what I was writing, not on some arbitrary criteria that I hadn't spent an X number of months in New York. Look, Central America became the ideological fault line at those times. First El Salvador, and then even more so Nicaragua. The executive editor and I had different views on Nicaragua. Intellectually different views, I thought. I went to Nicaragua from the background of El Salvador and Guatemala. And in Nicaragua, I didn't see pregnant women with their bellies slit open. I didn't see peasant heads stuck on fence posts. I didn't see tortured, mutilated bodies on dusty roads. The executive editor at the time went to Nicaragua, and he went from the background of Eastern Europe. And he saw a lot of similarities. I said to him, I understand, and maybe I should go spend some time in Eastern Europe. But, I mean, that's essentially, is where the differences were.
Did they not believe your story? They believed it, obviously, when they did. Did they look around?
Well, it wasn't only Mozote. I mean, it wasn't the last story that I wrote that was controversial at the time, in those times. I mean, Mozote, I think Mozote was the beginning of the end of my career at the New York Times. But then came the election, and I wrote several stories saying that there were questions about the number of people who had voted in the election. I wrote a news analysis that said, this election, the euphoria, those of you who remember, there was a great deal of euphoria because a lot of people voted, and there were about 700 or 800 journalists down there to record it all, and so on, and there was euphoria. And I wrote a news analysis that said, the euphoria simply isn't justified. It's not going to end the war. It's not going to end the fighting. It was the only, I think it was about the only article, I can say this honestly, it was the only article that was editorially changed that I wrote from Central America. And they just, basically what I said was all in it, but it was just pushed down further, and they had a different lead on it. Obviously, history absolves me. That election in 1982 was hardly we're just now signing the peace agreement, 11 years later. 10 years later. Listen, I'm not the first person whose reporting hasn't fit ideologically in the New York Times. Mine just happened to come at a moment when it was more an international issue or a Washington issue. There was more emotional attachment to it, and I quit. I'd done too many things in my life, and I'd always loved what I was doing, and I finally didn't feel that way anymore, and so I just quit. There was life after the New York Times. There'll be life after the New Yorker.
Yes, my name is Betty Brannon Haeng. I write for a Panamanian newspaper by the name of La Prensa. And I have a comment and a question. The comment is that just as you've pointed out that the problem in these situations is that reporting gets chilled, I'd like to add that the problem is also that many stories get killed. In the case of Panama, for example, in the early 80s and mid-80s, the Reagan administration State Department had decided that Panama was a democracy. And even though there were many people, and it was no secret that Panama was in fact a military kleptocracy, this story could not get into the American media until Seymour Hersh broke it on the front page of the New York Times in 1986. But as things turned out, the ambassador now in Panama is Dean Hinton. So my question is, do you have anything more that you'd like to say about Mr. Hinton's participation in that cover-up?
Oh, I mean, the record, no, I really don't. I mean, the record speaks for itself. I mean, Hinton, just as it was reported, I mean, I was just reading that from the most recent Washington Post story about the Mozote massacre. I'd even forgotten that he had said that at the time. Hinton was down there. Hinton went down there and said, I'm not going to criticize anybody publicly for anything, i.e. quiet diplomacy. Well, quiet diplomacy was a message to the Salvadoran military that they could continue with their usual ways. Didn't work. Quiet diplomacy usually doesn't work. Not with dictators and thugs.
Yes, my name is Larry Gerwin. My question actually is similar to what the last person said, but in a broader sense. It bothers me that people are not held accountable by the press for their lies. You mentioned before Thomas Enders. He had a paper trail in Cambodia, and it's amazing that it took Schanberg to write about it. Lots of people knew this. Hinton, apparently his career never suffered from this. Can you comment on why the press, if you have any thoughts on this, why the press fails to hold people accountable for what they've done over the years? Does everything go down a memory hole?
Yes, frankly. But I'm not sure. But I'm not sure it's hold them accountable. I mean, the accountability is supposed to be in the Congress.
Or at least point it out.
But a lot of times this evidence is out there. The material is there. I mean, take El Salvador and certification. I mean, year after year, every 6 months, I think they had to certify the progress was being made on human rights. The Congress kept funding El Salvador, kept funding the military, and kept saying one more time, this is the last time, and we're not going to. No more money. Well, they kept, that was $7.5 billion ago, and they kept funding it. When they got caught over and over again with the Contras, I mean, when Hassan Fass's place went down, or when the mining of the harbors. I remember the mining of the harbors. Moynihan, I think he said, "I'm pissed off." I think it was exactly what he said. But did he resign from the committee? No. And Moynihan is held in high regard, and in many regards justifiably. So I think there has been a lapse on the press. People, and on Hinton too in some ways. I mean, every time you see anything written about Hinton, or not every time, but often when you see something written about Hinton, you see a reference to his speech. He gave one tough speech in El Salvador in which he said, the work of the right-wing death squads has to stop. It was a tough speech, but what made it newsworthy and important was it was because of the year or 2 years or 3 years that he'd been there preceding. He hadn't, he hadn't criticized the Salvadoran government. Yeah, I mean, accountability. Things shouldn't go down a memory hole, but that's the way we journalists are. I mean, I don't think there is a great deal of looking back. There's not enough reliance on documents that are available at a place like the National Security Archive and elsewhere. Whether it's because journalists don't have time and they're writing daily stories. No.
Thank you.
Oftentimes, ideology and responsible reporting are terms not to go together. And you talk a lot about ideology today. I wonder if you could tell me what ideology does mean to you and how it does affect reporting and how important it is to the reporting process.
I'm not, you know, I mean, you're going to be more specific. I mean, what do you mean, biases?
I guess biases would be another term for it, yeah.
Objectivity? Is that, I mean, do you think, you know, we lose our objectivity?
I think your experience...
But I don't think I had I didn't have any ideology that I was trying to give vent to when I was down there. I don't see how anybody could have been down there seeing what I was seeing at the time and wouldn't have written the same thing. And I think every other reporter who was down there was writing the same thing. Unfortunately, there weren't enough reporters down there at certain times.
I think the question was asked in reference to your discussing the New York Times, little T, big T.
Yeah. Well, listen, I still think, and I really believe this, I think the New York Times is the greatest newspaper in the world, but it's not a flawless institution. It's not a flawless institution. And I think sometimes, I mean, the press maybe sometimes engages in too much navel-gazing, but I also think that sometimes we don't examine ourselves enough and we're not critical enough of mistakes that are made, and there is a reluctance to be critical. You know, the only one who really does it, and I think gets away with it, is you know, David Shaw at the LA Times. But I don't, you know, I don't think I mean, I don't think there was any big conspiracy at the New York Times. It was just, you know, it was just, and it wasn't just the New York Times. Listen, Alma, ask Alma what happened to her at the Washington Post. You know, a right-wing official of the administration wrote a letter to the Washington Post saying Alma had written for a communist newspaper. Alma had written in Mexico City. Now, Alma is Mexican by birth, but, you know, she'd never written for any newspaper in Mexico City. But the editor, a very, very, very senior editor at the Washington Post, came out of his office and said, have you written for this communist newspaper in Mexico City? And then they wrote back to this administration official saying, you know, she hasn't written for this newspaper, but we're going to watch her. You know, we're going to monitor her. You know, it wasn't in any way the 1950s. But I tell you something, there was a lot of ideology floating around this town in 80, 81, and 80, or 81 and 82 and 83 over Central America.
I'm Tina Rosenberg. I'm at the National Security Archive. Ray, I'd like to get your comment on a problem that seems to me to be a problem, and I think it's something that might get worse with the Clinton administration, and that is a sort of social coziness between administration officials and top editors and reporters, and one that I'm sure is mirrored in many cities. And whether you would suggest to newspapers certain kinds of rules regarding regarding situations that are not sort of straight interviews, but other kinds of contacts between people they're covering and the reporters themselves, and also whether you think that because there are an awful lot of reporters who in some ways feel an affinity with the Clinton administration, whether that could be a problem that will worsen now instead of getting better.
I'm not going to suggest any rules to newspapers. No, I agree with you, Tina. I mean, I say somewhat flippantly, but in a shorthand way, there's two schools of journalism. You either get close to the sources and socialize with them. I mean, I sometimes say there's the Bob Woodward School and the Cy Hirsch School. I mean, I happen to be in the Cy Hirsch School, but it may be because I don't have the social graces that it takes to socialize with these people. But I can't, I mean, this is a personal thing. I can't write tough things about people I socialize. I just can't do it. You know, some people can. I mean, I said that to somebody recently, a friend of mine who's a close friend who was going into the Clinton administration, and I said, you know, I'm not sure I'm going to see you much anymore, and I just want you to understand why. And he said, well, what kind of an attitude is that? How do you think you're going to get information? We're going to be this, no, and he was right. I mean, there is a part of that where it is a way to get information. I think you have to do, I wouldn't want to suggest any rules. I think, as your question suggesting, I think there's too much coziness. But I'm reflecting Ray Bonner's view of journalism, and let me tell you something, that's not only not the only one, but certainly not the right one. That's the way I work, it's the way I have to do it, but I think every journalist has to, if you can socialize with somebody and write tough stories about him or her, whew, more power to you. I can't do it. So I just don't socialize with them. No loss for me and no loss for them.
Last question.
Yeah, having been in Africa, now with Somalia aside, number one, how do you think the press, the U.S. press, has covered Africa in general, and what are the stories now that we're missing?
Well, that's a good way, and I do have one suggestion for newspapers apropos that. It's hard for me to be very objective about coverage of Africa since my wife is, since I'm really not Ray Bonner, I'm the husband of Jane Perlez, who's the New York Times correspondent in Africa. The story that's being missed in Africa is the Sudan. I mean, you are going to wake up tomorrow morning with a situation in Sudan that makes Somalia seem like it never happened. I can tell you, already probably the famine is as bad, if not worse. The government in Khartoum is in that league with North Korea. A few that are still left. It's a horrendous situation. There is, to use the new phrase, ethnic cleansing in the southern and western part of the Sudan. It's a serious problem. We're either going to send in troops, or we're going to have a much worse situation in Sudan than we've ever had in Somalia, and there are serious security interests at stake there. There was no security interest, none, period, in Somalia. But that leads me to the other thing, and I'll close on this. I think what papers need to do is expand their foreign staffs. I know all of you will love that because many of you want to be foreign correspondents. You got to do it. We are the world's policeman now, and we may be becoming the world's missionary after Somalia, and we don't know anything about the world. We woke up one morning to find out that Kuwait, we were going to war over Kuwait. I think if you ran a Dateline check on Kuwait, in fact, there was a wonderful talk of the town comment in the New Yorker, the old New Yorker. The first issue after the invasion, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, saying, Kuwait? We're preparing to go to war in Kuwait. Nobody knew where Kuwait was. We've just dispatched troops to Somalia? I mean, how many people had heard about Somalia? Paren, other than those who were reading Jane's dispatches in the New York Times, close paren. But seriously, where's it going to be next? The New York Times is no longer the top of the list with foreign bureaus. The LA Times leads. There's a newspaper in Denmark, a regional newspaper in Denmark, not even in Copenhagen, that has more foreign bureaus than any American newspaper. Full foreign bureaus. The networks have no bureaus in the South anymore, North-South. None. I mean, you had Dan Rather and Tom Brokaw and all these crews in Somalia. I don't think any of those people had ever even been in Africa on assignment, let alone in Somalia. I believe it now. I've been working on this for a while. I think the networks, and now since we're told that most Americans get their news from the networks, have no bureaus in the South. There's none in Africa, there's none in Latin America, and there's none in Asia. They've got them in, maybe between them they have 2 or 3 bureaus, but virtually none. How can we become the world's policeman when we don't know anything about the world we're policing? That's what newspapers need to do. They really need to beef up their foreign coverage. And that would be the only suggestion I would have, Nina.
Hi, I'm Ines Alicia with CQ. I wanted to ask you if you would follow that question up with what stories are we missing in Latin America?
Same story we've been missing in Latin America for as long as I was ever down there, and that's Guatemala. Don't ask me why. I mean, I used to say 10 years ago, if you think El Salvador is the undercovered story, Guatemala is the uncovered story. Don't ask me to explain why. I don't know why. That's the only, I mean, look, I've been in Africa for 4.5 years. I haven't really followed Central America, and Latin America. I think You know, we're covering probably Peru enough. I think enough. Obviously, the people who live in Peru, and Gustavo Gorriti wouldn't think we're covering Peru enough, and he's right. The story, I'll tell you the story that's being missed. The biggest story of all is Turkey. Turkey is the only, and that's a story can be done in Washington too. We are cutting our reports on Turkey to fit policy. And when I say cutting, I mean, yes, Vietnam type, cutting our reports out of Turkey to fit policy, to not offend Turkey. Turkey is the only country that's come out of the Cold War stronger. I don't mean countries that participated in it. I mean, all of us are stronger because we don't have the same military threats. I mean, as a country, as a lever. Turkey has more influence now over the West than it had before because of its location. I mean, tell you something, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, the networks, everybody ought to have a bureau in Turkey. And you're going to have in 18 months or 24 months. But it ought to be done now and start reporting on it now until it becomes too late.
Last question.
Okay.
I'm Paul Schmidt from Denmark, Danish journalist. I just want to let you know that my colleague from the paper you mentioned before is sitting behind me. So it was a true story you told, but I'm asking the question that I fully understand the ideological front line at that time you're talking about. Does it mean that there were no commercial interest in the decision on the New York Times at the time?
I don't think so. I mean, I heard Ralph's speech yesterday, and I used to work for Ralph. I don't think, and I think in regional papers, smaller papers, let's say, in smaller places, I don't think advertisers have one bit of influence over the New York Times. I mean, I can't imagine an advertiser getting an audience with the publisher of the New York Times, as Reed Irvine from Accuracy in Media, used to get an audience with the publisher of the New York Times and the Washington Post, and as far as I know, the Los Angeles Times and elsewhere. But no, I don't think advertising at a place like the New York Times or the Washington Post or the LA Times or Philadelphia Inquirer, any of the big papers, I don't think they exercise any influence.
Thank you.
It'd be easier if they did. I mean, that's easy to grapple with, but I think it's much more ideological, if you will.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That concludes today's luncheon.